This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us on this Wednesday's program, we begin with K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen. He joins us to share his take on the EPA recently releasing a final ruling on what they define as a water of the United States. Also ahead, Kansas Lease Laws are quite unique when it comes to the rules put in place to protect both landowners and leasers alike. To break down everything listeners should know about the sometimes confusing topic, K-State agricultural economist Reid and LaVell Winsor from the Farm Analyst program join us while also previewing their upcoming 4-part workshop in January and February. We end with K-State experts Brad White, Bob Larson, and Phillip Lancaster for this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. They answer a listener's question on whether or not unrolling hay is the best method when feeding cattle. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen for an ag law update. But first and foremost, Roger, Happy New Year and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Samantha.
Absolutely. So today you wanted to discuss a very recent event that has gone on. The Environmental Protection Agency has kind of jumped the gun on a definition that's been debated over for almost 40 years now. So let's talk about what the waters of the United States really is.
Yeah, that's right. It's definitely one way to put it, and that's kind of how I view what has happened, is that the federal agencies have come out here with a final rule as to what the definition of a water of the United States is, and of course put out a joint memorandum with USDA to cover what a wetland is for purposes of swamp buster. But they did all of this, and why I think it's appropriate to say that they jumped the gun. They did all of this and put this redefinition out while there is a pending case before the United States Supreme Court on the very same issue. And that ultimately what the U.S. Supreme Court says the definition should be will rule the day, not what the regulatory agencies say, although it is possible that the U.S. Supreme Court may come out with a position that is either what the rule says or very similar to it. We just don't know that at this point in time.
Sure. So, Roger, for those that are listening and they're maybe not familiar with kind of what WOTUS is kind of what it's being called by some, it really started, like we said, 40 years ago with the Clean Water Act. Is that right?
Yeah, actually a little bit further to the Clean Water Act amendments in 1972, where the Congress tried to define what a water of the United States is. And then for purposes of the Clean Water Act, you can't discharge what's defined to be a pollutant into the navigable waters of the United States without a federal discharge permit. So the term that's at issue right now that's in there is navigable waters of the United States. What is that? Well, that's commonly understood when you bring the Corps of Engineers in here. Of course, their role is to regulate navigation, and the EPA's role is to regulate pollution. And what Congress did was they kind of put the two together, and sometimes they don't fit well together and don't make a whole lot of sense. But this issue of what is a navigable water of the United States that requires a federal permit to have a discharge of a pollutant into has really bothered agriculture for about 4 decades because this got into the hands of activist groups. It got into the hands of the courts. The courts have struggled with trying to figure out what Congress's intent was, what the scope of a navigable water is. And this is an important issue for farmers because if you're deemed to have a wetland on your property that is connected somehow to federally jurisdictional waters, you have to have a federal discharge permit. Very, very costly to have that. There are also draconian penalties and fines that come into place if you don't get that permit and you were supposed to. That's what's at stake.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned producers. Obviously, it's a big deal for them with the way this rules one way or another. We'll see. But, the region that is affected most by this is somewhat the upper Midwest. Is that right?
Yeah, I think simply because what the agencies are doing, what the Corps and the EPA are doing with this rule is they're bringing back the pre-2015 understanding of adjacency, kind of what the Obama administration was doing, and some of the courts had taken the position that you don't have to define adjacency by meaning something that abuts or is next to. So if I have a wetland on my property, I have a ditch on my property that it is next to a navigable water, well, okay, we could think of that as adjacency. But what they're doing with this rule is that they're saying not only is that the case, but we can get you there in terms of connecting the dots to say that you have a federally regulable wetland on your property or you have a water in the United States under a significant nexus test. And that is a very big change, and they say that we can establish a significant nexus by a shallow hydrologic subsurface connection to a water in the United States. Well, what that is farm field drain tile, a shallow hydrologic subsurface connection. So if I have Iowa farm ground that's all pattern tiled, I'm in the prairie pothole region in the Dakotas or in Minnesota, or I've got even ephemeral streams in Kansas, these intermittent streams that sometimes have water in them, sometimes don't, have very shallow water table. That is of concern to farmers that produce in those areas with those type of geological and geophysical characteristics.
You mentioned the jumping of the gun in terms of this definition and that the EPA is trying to kind of beat, I guess, the Supreme Court almost to the punch of getting this defined. But really, one way or another, you mentioned that this doesn't change how the Supreme Court may rule. So how do you see this continuing on, this definition debate?
Well, that's a real good question. The case is pending before the Supreme Court. It comes from upper Idaho, and people that were trying to build a home on a lot that they'd purchased that was about 100 yards away from a lake, which does fit the definition of a navigable water. And they didn't have any water on their property, but by virtue of this adjacency and this nexus test that the courts used, they connected the dots and said that you've got to stop development or it's going to be significant fines amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars. What's before the U.S. Supreme Court? So squarely before the court is, what is the definition of a water in the United States, which is what the agencies just came out and redefined. This is the third iteration of this in about 8 years. And they just go back and forth and back and forth. But frankly, in my mind, they should have waited until the U.S. Supreme Court said what their view of this is, because that's going to define what the law is, and then you write your rules to fill in the blanks and define the boundaries of the framework that the Supreme Court has given you. But no, they've gotten out in front of this, and I don't think it's going to have any bearing on the Supreme Court's determination. It may cause a delay in the Supreme Court's opinion coming out because they might look at that. They may want to comment on it, but I don't think it'll have any impact on the case that's currently before the Supreme Court. The rule doesn't take effect until 60 days after it's been published in the Federal Register. So basically, we can think if they're going to go ahead and publish it right away, just kind of benchmark March 1 in your mind as to when this would take effect. We may or may not have that U.S. Supreme Court opinion by then. So it's kind of an interesting period of time that we're in right now, but this is really troubling for farmers that have any type of drainage tile, that have prior converted cropland, because the definition of that and the way they look at that is going to be changed under this. And that prior converted cropland issue is also a big issue in Kansas as well as in Nebraska and our listening area here.
Absolutely. And when the Supreme Court took up this case, like you mentioned, it's the building of a house that's kind of in question here in this case specifically. Do you think they realized the unintended consequences that this could have on agriculture when they took up this case and then the EPA got involved immediately? There's
actually a long history of U.S. Supreme Court decisions, several significant decisions involving this particular issue. Back about 15 years ago and 20 years ago, they've been down this road twice. Now, unfortunately, in those opinions, they were not clear in their opinions they issued. And in fact, they were so fractured in one case that they had multiple opinions come out just on that one case. And that's what's created the confusion, because the lower courts didn't know which test to apply. They didn't know whether to apply Justice Kennedy's test or Justice Scalia's test, and the courts have been all over the board on this. And that's what's created the problem, and then the agencies have tried to write different rules, and every time the administration changes, we get a different rule interpretation. So I'm hoping this time that the Supreme Court, and they certainly understand the impact on ag that this has, because they've mentioned that in some of the prior opinions. I'm hoping this time that they're very clear on construing Congress's intent when Congress wrote the statute, and gives us some really good guidelines in terms of what the scope of a navigable water of the United States is and how that can impact private property. I guess they say third time's the charm for a reason, right, Roger? I hope so.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think listeners will echo the same sentiment, hopefully, and understanding kind of where this hopeful final ruling will leave us at in terms of understanding what a navigable water of the United States is. But Roger, in the meantime, if listeners are wanting to stay up to date on this case specifically, where can they do that at?
So I've got a lengthy blog article that I just published on January 2. It's on my website, which is washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. It'll also be posted on the Ag Manager website from the Ag Econ Department at K-State.
Wonderful. Well, I will link to that as well in the show notes of today's show, which can be found on agtoday.net as always. So if listeners are wanting to find that, they can find an easy-to-click link there as well. And Roger, as always, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, that was K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen joining us for an ag law update regarding the EPA trying to jump the gun on a final ruling defining waters of the United States. If you're listening to us on the radio and are afraid you're going to miss out on our next segment because you're reaching your destination or have something else that you're having to switch to quickly here, don't forget the Agriculture Today programming is also available as a podcast. Our podcast is easily accessible on all podcasting platforms, including our website, agtoday.net, as well as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. You can simply search us on any podcasting platform, Agriculture Today, Kansas State, and we are more than likely to pop up, and you can follow us there. That way you can simply have us pop up in your regular feed on whatever platform you're using and listen to us more regularly that way. Once again, you can easily access that on agtoday.net or any podcasting platform by simply searching Agriculture Today, Kansas State. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by LaVell Winsor. She is a K-State farm financial analyst. LaVell, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And Robin Reid, she is a K-State farm economist. So Robin, thanks for being here.
Yep, thank you.
Absolutely. So today we're going to be talking through some Kansas lease laws. And Robin, as we were discussing before, there's some uniqueness here in Kansas in terms of the laws that are in place and then how things are done when it comes to leases. So let's start with those.
Yeah, so it's very traditional here in Kansas to just have an oral lease. Basically, nothing is in writing, and it's a handshake agreement between a landowner and a tenant. And that is still occurring widespread across the state today, and there's not really anything wrong with it if disputes do not arise. But Kansas has a very good set of laws that help protect the landowner and the tenant when there's not a written lease. One thing I'll emphasize, I'm not saying it's a good idea to not have a written lease. I do think it is. And the reason being that written lease will really spell out any intentions that the landowner and the tenant have for that specific lease agreement. And if a dispute arises, you can go to that written lease and say, well, what did we agree to? The tricky part when it's oral, yes, there's a set of statutes that I'm going to talk about. But if the tenant and the landlord had intentions of doing something otherwise, but it's not in writing, it's very hard for a court system to really look into, well, what party really is correct in this arrangement. So what I'll talk about is the state statutes, but again, having a lease in writing is a good idea end of the day.
Absolutely. Yeah, you told me that, and my eyebrows clearly raised because that's just so shocking to hear sometimes. But like you said, this has been going on in a lot of families for multiple generations at this point. So there's a huge element of trust there when it comes to some of these agreements.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's still very prevalent today. We have multi-generational leases that have been leasing to the same tenant family for a lot of different years and just have a really good relationship. And what I should emphasize too is just communication, end of the day. Talking to your tenant or talking to your landlord really can head off a lot of these disputes before they even happen. Just talking through some of the issues that might arise before they become big issues is really what you want to do in any of these oral or written arrangements.
Absolutely. And a lot of that communication, like you said, would take place if you were doing a written lease anyway. So it's like, well, might as well, I guess, in some situations. But if not, there are some laws in Kansas, like you mentioned, that are put in place to kind of protect both parties here. So let's talk through those.
Yeah, so let's just start with the basics. So basically, if nothing is in writing, so you're subject to an oral lease, that lease by statute is only 1 year in length. And that starts March 1st and runs through March 1st of the following year. The other nuance is that automatically renews unless that lease is properly terminated. So again, it's a year-to-year lease. If there's nothing in writing, it's a year-to-year lease, and notice of termination needs to happen when that lease would be discontinued. Going from there, there's specific property laws and contract laws that these leases are subject to. So just to talk first about a property law. So basically the right of possession tells us that as the landowner leases to the tenant has rights to that property for that leased period, and that landowner does not actually have certain rights for their own ground during that time. So a good example of this would be hunting rights. So with an oral lease, really what happens is that tenant has exclusive rights to the property, and the landowner doesn't really have the right to go onto their land and hunt unless they talk to the tenant about that and preferably have it in a written lease that they retained those rights to the property. The landowner can go on their property to do certain inspections, to do repairs of the property, show the property to prospective buyers, collect rent, or deliver notice of termination. There's certain things that a landowner can still do on their leased property. But basically, that property is in the hands of the tenant for that lease period. One other thing is the right to harvest the crops. So basically, the crops that are growing on that ground are considered generally the personal property of the tenant. So if they get terminated and, say, have wheat in the ground, obviously that'll be growing past March 1st and be harvested then. The tenant does have the right to go in and harvest that crop still because that is their personal property. There are some nuances there depending on the landowner and if they would pass away during the terms of the lease and what type of ownership they have on the ground and things like that. But basically, the tenant has the right to the crops on the ground. Noxious weed control is another big issue on leased ground. The statutes say it's both the tenant and the landowner's responsibility to take care of those noxious weeds. So that's something to really talk to the tenant about, because if they have control over that property, really they should probably be taking care of those weeds. But in reality, what's going to happen if they don't is the county weed supervisor will go in and treat or take care of those weeds, and the bill will come to the landowner. So good thing to talk about with your tenant ahead of time and who's going to be taking care of that.
Absolutely. Key to know for sure. And you mentioned earlier the proper termination of these agreements. And the key word there is being proper. So let's talk through what that proper termination looks like.
Yeah, I would say this is probably the number one question that we get, and a lot of times do refer to an attorney to handle the situation just because it has to be done in a certain way. So basically, like I said, the lease runs March 1st to March 1st if it's oral, but the termination notice must be in writing 30 days prior to March 1st. The catcher there is February only has 28 days. So really by the end of January, this termination notice needs to be delivered to the tenant. And that notice has to be physically given to the tenant, whether it be by certified mail. It has to be in writing. So certified mail, if the tenant cannot be found, it can be left at the tenant's usual place of residence, given to someone 12 years of age that is at that residence, or posted in a conspicuous place. I would say end of the day, the best thing is that certified mail where you get that return receipt that they have to sign, that they did receive the notice. Some of the special stipulations in that termination, if the ground was prepared last fall, say we've been putting in hydrous down right now for some of our corn that'll be planted next spring. If termination is given, the tenant does have the right to be reimbursed for those expenses that they had in preparation for next year's crop. Now, obviously, wheat, again, is the hard one because you plant that in the fall. They would have the right to harvest that wheat, and then the lease would terminate either the last day of harvest or August 1st, whatever comes earliest. I will mention, too, this is the same if you have pasture ground or hay ground. It is subject to the same set of statutes. So you would, again, be giving that written notice 30 days prior to March 1st.
Absolutely. Key to know and timely for sure as we're airing this and sharing it with you all. And timely as well because you guys have some conferences that are coming up, multiple weeks of conferences that you're going to be speaking over subjects just like this, subjects where a lot of listeners have maybe various questions having to do with leases or certain laws, things like that. So LaVell, tell us a bit about these.
Yes, so the series that's coming up is The Power of Negotiation and Communication, and we'll be focusing on a lot of aspects of leasing. And that series will be once a week on Wednesday evenings, starting January 18th and running through February 8th. And we will cover a whole variety of aspects. The series will kick off with a keynote speaker who goes over a general ag economy overview and then go into a lot of the leasing issues, such as the state lease basics, what are the basics of having a good lease, going through the state statutes in detail, and then going into things like fence law, which fence law is a very high topic as well that we have a lot of questions on. And then all the way through the last night, the focus is going to be on conservation and how that might be worked into the lease issues as well. So this series is modeled after a couple of series that we've done the last couple of years. The first one we did just prior to COVID in 2020 that was focused on farm financials, and we had just shy of 700 people who attended across the state at that time. And then last winter, we focused on risk management and had another COVID bump. So we had about 350 people who attended across the state. So these are in-person series. There's 34 locations across the state, so hopefully nobody has to go very far to get to a location. We are doing this particular series in concert with Nebraska and Indiana as well, so they will be hosting these same topics and the same keynote speakers will be going on at the exact same time as ours. Because this leasing topic, we know that in the state of Kansas we have a lot of absentee landowners. We are going to offer a hybrid option where it's also online, the online option as well. If you are in the state and near a location, we really encourage people to go to a location because we know that there is great power in this series just from hearing from the other participants that are there and doing the activities together. That's very, very valuable. But we know that there's some landowners who live out of state, would not ever be able to get to a location. And so we are offering the online option as well. The in-person option will be $50 for the series. They will receive a meal with that each night, along with all of the materials. And then the hybrid option is $75, and we will be shipping those materials. As far as sign-up goes, people will want to go to the agmanager.info website, and there's a link right there to register, or they can also work with their local extension agent to get signed up as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Encouraging listeners to sign up well before that January 18th date just so they can have their spot secured and they're ready to go. Can't thank you both enough for your time today. I really do appreciate it, and I know listeners do as well. So thank you both so much.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Once again, that was LaVell Winsor. She's our K-State Farm Financial Analyst, as well as Reid, our K-State Farm Economist. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. We're ending Agriculture Today programming with K-State experts Brad White, Bob Larson, and Phillip Lancaster for this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. Ahead of us now, they answer a listener's question on whether or not unrolling hay is the best method when feeding cattle.
Hi, welcome to Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, where our experts answer your question. I'm Brad White, joined today by Dr. Bob Larson. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Brad.
And Dr. Phillip Lancaster.
Hey, Brad.
We're happy to have these guys here because they're going to get a chance to answer one of your questions and give their opinion. And as they give their opinion, they'll get a score that's up to 10 points. If you have a question you'd like us to talk about, you can send us an email at bci@ksu.edu. Today's question comes from a listener, and I think it's a great one because it's very applicable. It is also pretty simple. Should I unroll hay when I'm feeding cows? So if I've got round bales, should I unroll hay when I'm feeding cows? And Phillip, I'm going to go to you first.
Well, I think there are some benefits to it. If I'm unrolling hay, I'm spreading nutrients out across the pasture. It's easy for me to move that around every time I put out hay so that I'm getting a different part of the pasture. I think there's some benefits as far as calf health. I don't have mud packed around the bale ring, I don't have calves getting in there and getting trampled and getting broken legs or stuck in the mud or whatever. And so there are some definite positives to it.
So calf health, spreading nutrients around, absolutely. I think both are really good positives. So you're a pro for unrolling hay. 7 points with Phillip. Bob?
I think there's some times when unrolling hay is a really good idea, but some of the negatives are you're probably going to waste quite a bit more, and it really does depend on the type of hay as well. Some of our poor quality forages, things like that, if you unroll it, I think you're going to end up wasting a lot. They're going to eat the very best. And in a year when forage is hard to come by and quite expensive, probably would prefer to keep it in a bale ring so that I can reduce the waste. But I'm going to admit that I do have to probably worry a little bit more about mud, worry a little bit about exposure of calves to those areas, and try to make that as good an environment as I can while putting it in a bale rig.
Excellent. So, Bob, you had 7 points, but you actually lost a point before we came on the air by making fun of me. So you're actually going to get 6 points. I don't know. That's the official ruling from the judges. Yeah. So now I want you to flip. Phillip, you argue for what are some of the reasons that you might not want to unroll it. Bob highlighted some of them. Is there anything else to add to what Bob said?
Waste is probably the biggest one. You're not getting as much utilization out of that hay as you can, and they're going to lay on it, they're going to defecate on it, and it just becomes bedding, especially like you said, if it's poor quality hay. The other negative is that if I am not moving it around the pasture and I've only got a limited amount of space to unroll it, or if I have to try to unroll it down steep slopes or things like that, then it's not as effective as cows being able to eat, and so then I waste more, or I have spots where I am killing out the pasture because I've got a whole bunch of dead material on top of it come springtime.
All right, Bob, pros for unrolling.
I do like unrolling when we've got calves out there for the main purpose that I've run into situations, and it depends on weather, depends on location and things like that, where a area where you're feeding round bales in round bale feeders, whether it's a dry lot or just a corner of a pasture, they can become really messy, and we can really have some calf health challenges. And so in those situations, I will actually have them move towards unrolling bales so that they stop congregating calves and cows in a small area. So from a calf health standpoint, it's something to consider sometimes.
And that ends up with both of you having 8. So I've got a toss-up question for you on what do you expect is the average percent of hay? You both said, hey, you might waste a lot more when you're unrolling. What's the average percent of hay that you would waste in unrolling versus feeding in a bale ring feeder?
Well, it depends. How much am I unrolling? Am I unrolling just enough for that day, or am I unrolling hay for the 3 or 4 days? And so the more hay I unroll, the higher the percentage of wastage. If you're doing that multiple days, you're probably wasting 25-30% when unrolling, when you're probably 10 to 15% in a hay feeder.
Okay, so a 10 to 20% range?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm guessing. But I honestly think you could easily waste 50% unrolling it, particularly if you unroll several days. I think you're wasting a significant amount, which is why it's a hard decision.
Yeah. So you might only want to do it part-time, and I'm going to lean closer to Bob's answer. I have no data either, but it's going to be somewhere in that ballpark. So Bob ends up 9, Phillip 8. Thank you for joining us. If you have another question, something you'd like us to talk about, you can always send us an email at bci@ksu.edu.
That concludes today's programming. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.